Yesterday, without warning, you became the center of someone's emotional storm while you were living your life unaware. They were overwhelmed by a feeling they could neither control nor escape. Emotional entanglement intensifies even in physical absence because human attachment is not primarily sustained by proximity, but by psychological encoding. Once a person has been registered in the emotional memory system as significant, the mind continues to activate their representation even when no real-time interaction occurs. This happens through associative networks in the brain where sensory cues, memories, and emotional residues keep reconstructing the presence of the other person internally. In simple terms, the mind keeps replaying the person as if they are still emotionally active in the environment. When distance is introduced, the external input stops, but the internal simulation increases. The brain does not tolerate unresolved emotional patterns easily, so it compensates by amplifying recall, imagination, and projection. This is why absence often feels louder than presence. The nervous system starts filling gaps with emotionally charged interpretations rather than neutral facts. The attachment system, which is designed to maintain bonding, becomes more active when the perceived connection is incomplete or uncertain. In this state, even minor memories gain disproportionate weight. A single conversation, a facial expression, or an unfinished moment can become repeatedly analyzed and emotionally magnified. The unconscious mind does not differentiate clearly between past experience and present emotional activation, so it treats recollection as ongoing experience. This creates a loop where the person is continuously felt rather than simply remembered. At the same time, emotional regulation weakens when there is no closure or reassurance. The absence of feedback from the other person removes grounding, allowing imagination to dominate perception. This is why feelings can intensify rather than fade. The mind is actively maintaining connection through internal reconstruction. Over time, this process deepens the emotional imprint, making the attachment feel even more real despite the lack of physical interaction, and the person begins to occupy more mental space than they did when they were actually present in daily life. The unconscious mind amplifies unresolved connections overnight, because during sleep, the conscious filters that normally regulate emotional interpretation are significantly reduced. In waking life, rational thinking, distraction, and external responsibilities help contain emotional intensity. However, once the mind enters a sleep state, these regulatory systems quiet down, allowing deeper psychological material to surface more freely. This is when unresolved emotional bonds become especially active. The unconscious does not process relationships in linear or logical terms. Instead, it works through symbolic association, emotional memory, and internal projection. If a connection with another person remains incomplete, ambiguous, or emotionally charged, the unconscious continues to work on it, even when the individual is asleep. This is not a deliberate process, but an automatic attempt by the psyche to restore equilibrium by resolving what remains unsettled. During the night, particularly in REM sleep, emotional memory consolidation is heightened. The brain replays significant emotional experiences, not as exact replicas, but as intensified versions shaped by internal feeling states. If a person has unresolved attachment towards someone, their mind may repeatedly reconstruct scenarios involving that person, blending memory with imagination. This creates an internal emotional loop where feelings are re-experienced with amplified intensity. Because external distractions are absent, the emotional signal becomes clearer and more dominant. The unconscious essentially isolates what matters most emotionally and brings it to the forefront of internal experience. This can result in heightened longing, anxiety, or emotional yearning upon waking, even if the person cannot consciously explain why. The boundary between past and present becomes less rigid during sleep. This allows emotional impressions tied to a specific person to feel immediate and present rather than distant. The unconscious treats unresolved relational energy as unfinished psychological work, repeatedly revisiting it in an attempt to integrate or stabilize it, which is why emotional connections often feel stronger after a night's sleep rather than weaker, even when no new external interaction has occurred. Psychological projection makes one person feel possessed by another because the mind has a natural tendency to relocate internal, unacknowledged emotions onto an external figure. When someone experiences feelings they cannot fully understand, accept, or integrate, such as longing, guilt, desire, fear of loss, or emotional dependency, the psyche often externalizes these inner states by attaching them to another person. That person then becomes the container for emotions that actually originate within the observer. In this process, the individual is no longer reacting purely to the real person, but to a psychologically constructed version of them. This constructed version is shaped by internal needs, unresolved conflicts, and emotional history. As a result, the intensity of feeling directed toward the other person can become disproportionate to the actual interaction. The mind begins to interpret neutral or ambiguous signals as deeply meaningful, reinforcing the illusion of emotional control or influence. The sensation of being possessed arises because projection reduces the boundary between self and other in perception. Emotional content that belongs internally is experienced as if it is coming from the outside source. The person projecting may feel as though the other individual is constantly present in their thoughts, influencing their mood, or triggering uncontrollable reactions. In reality, they are encountering their own displaced emotional material. This mechanism is especially strong when there is unresolved attachment or emotional ambiguity. The less clarity there is in the relationship, the more the unconscious mind fills in gaps with projection. The other person becomes symbolic rather than literal, representing unmet needs or unresolved internal patterns. This symbolic weight gives them an exaggerated psychological presence. Over time, the projection can create a feedback loop where the imagined version of the person becomes more influential than the real one. Emotional responses are then driven by this internalized image, making it feel as though the other person has a controlling presence in the psyche, when in fact it is the mind continuously interacting with its own unprocessed emotional content, shaping perception in a way that feels external but is internally generated. Sudden emotional surges often signal suppressed attachment because emotions that are not consciously acknowledged do not disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious until a trigger activates them. In everyday life, people tend to regulate or suppress feelings that feel inconvenient, overwhelming, or socially inappropriate. However, suppression does not eliminate the emotional charge. It merely pushes it out of conscious awareness while it continues to exist beneath the surface of the psyche. When a trigger appears, this could be a memory, a message, a silence, or even a subtle association, the suppressed attachment can break through the psychological barrier and emerge suddenly as an intense emotional wave. This surge often feels disproportionate to the immediate situation because it is not only about the present moment. It is the result of accumulated emotional material that has been building over time without proper expression or resolution. Suppressed attachment is particularly powerful because attachment systems in the brain are designed for continuity and connection. When that continuity is interrupted or uncertain, the system does not shut down. Instead, it remains active in a background state. This creates a readiness for emotional activation that can remain dormant until something reawakens it. Once activated, the emotional response can feel sudden, even explosive. The person may experience longing, anxiety, sadness, or intense preoccupation without a clear external reason. This happens because the conscious mind is only witnessing the final output of a longer internal process that has been developing quietly in the unconscious. The surge is also amplified by contrast. When emotional suppression is strong, the difference between the contained state and the released state becomes extreme, making the feeling seem abrupt. In reality, it is not sudden in origin, only in perception. These emotional waves often reveal that the attachment was never fully processed or integrated. Instead, it remained stored in an unresolved form, and when the right internal or external cue appears, the psyche releases it in a concentrated burst of feeling that temporarily overwhelms rational interpretation and distorts the sense of emotional timing and intensity. Dreams act as a bridge between hidden desire and conscious awareness, because during sleep, the mind enters a state where symbolic processing replaces rational filtering. In waking life, awareness is governed by logic, social conditioning, and intentional control, which often suppress or organize emotional impulses into acceptable forms. However, when sleep begins, these conscious structures loosen, allowing deeper layers of the psyche to express themselves in indirect and symbolic ways. In this state, the unconscious mind communicates not through direct statements, but through imagery, scenarios, and emotional impressions. These dream formations often combine fragments of memory, unresolved feelings, and latent desires into narratives that do not follow logical rules but carry emotional truth. A person who holds unrecognized attachment or emotional intensity towards someone may find that person appearing in dreams in altered or symbolic forms. This does not necessarily reflect literal intention or prediction, but rather the mind's attempt to process emotional material that has not been fully integrated during waking hours. The dreaming brain essentially reorganizes emotional data, and in doing so, it reveals what is active beneath conscious awareness. This is why dreams can feel emotionally significant even when their content appears strange or fragmented. Hidden desire plays a key role in this process, because desires that are not acknowledged openly tend to shift into symbolic representation. The unconscious does not erase them. It transforms them into imagery that can bypass conscious resistance. This allows feelings that are suppressed or unexpressed to surface in a disguised form, where they can be partially experienced without triggering defensive logic. Conscious awareness upon waking may not fully understand the dream content, but the emotional residue often remains. This lingering feeling is important because it shows that the unconscious has processed material that the conscious mind has not yet addressed. Over time, repeated dream patterns involving a specific person indicate ongoing internal engagement with that emotional connection, revealing that the psyche is actively working through attachment dynamics that remain unresolved in conscious reality. One-sided emotional awakening can feel overwhelming and destabilizing because it activates attachment systems without the grounding effect of mutual emotional feedback. In a balanced emotional exchange, feelings are regulated through interaction, reassurance, and shared meaning. When that reciprocity is absent, the emotional experience becomes internally amplified because all emotional processing is handled within a single psyche without external correction or stabilization. In such situations, the mind begins to generate its own validation loops. Thoughts about the other person become intensified because they are not being answered or balanced by real-time interaction. This creates a form of emotional inflation, where internal narratives grow larger than the actual relational reality. The person experiencing the awakening may feel as though their emotions are unusually strong, sudden, or difficult to contain, even though the underlying cause is the lack of external regulation rather than the intensity of the connection itself. The destabilizing effect comes from uncertainty. The brain's attachment system is designed to seek clarity, predictability, and response. When those elements are missing, it enters a heightened state of monitoring, constantly scanning internal and external cues for meaning. This hyper-attentive state increases emotional sensitivity, making even minor thoughts or memories feel significant and charged. At the same time, the lack of mutual acknowledgement prevents closure. Without feedback, the emotional system cannot complete its natural cycle of expression and resolution. Instead, it remains in a loop of anticipation and interpretation. This loop often produces confusion because the individual may struggle to distinguish between genuine emotional depth and internally amplified perception. The feeling becomes overwhelming because it is internally self-sustaining. Each thought reinforces the next, and each memory deepens the emotional tone. Over time, the experience can feel consuming, as though the person is emotionally too present in the mind, despite the absence of real-world interaction. This imbalance between internal intensity and external silence is what creates the sense of emotional instability, making the awakening feel far stronger than what external circumstances alone would justify. Silence between two people increases internal noise because the human mind is not designed to remain emotionally neutral in the absence of relational feedback. When communication is active, attention is distributed across real-time signals such as words, tone, timing, and emotional cues. These external inputs anchor perception and provide structure to emotional interpretation. However, when silence replaces interaction, that anchoring disappears, and the mind begins to generate its own signals to compensate for the lack of information. This internal generation process is driven by the brain's need to reduce uncertainty. In the absence of clarity, the cognitive system shifts into predictive mode, attempting to infer meaning from incomplete data. This leads to repetitive thinking patterns where the same questions, memories, or emotional impressions are continuously revisited. The silence does not produce emptiness. It produces amplification of internal dialogue. Emotionally, silence removes the regulatory feedback loop that normally stabilizes attachment. Without response, reassurance, or rejection, the emotional system remains unresolved. This unresolved state creates tension, which manifests as mental activity. The mind keeps reprocessing past interactions, searching for hidden meaning or overlooked signals, even when none exist. As a result, neutral memories can become emotionally charged through repeated interpretation. Silence also weakens temporal clarity. Events from the past begin to feel more immediate because there is no new information to distinguish then from now. This blurring of emotional time increases the intensity of recollection, making previous interactions feel more significant than they objectively were. At the same time, silence allows projection to increase. In the absence of real communication, the mind fills gaps with assumptions, imagined scenarios, and emotional expectations. These internal constructions often feel real because they are emotionally reinforced, even though they are not based on current reality. The result is a paradox where external quietness leads to internal loudness. The less there is to interpret externally, the more the mind generates internally, creating a cycle of overthinking, emotional amplification, and heightened psychological activity centered around the absence itself rather than the actual interaction. The mind seeks closure because unresolved emotional or cognitive loops create internal tension that the psyche naturally attempts to reduce. Closure is essentially the brain's way of restoring predictability and emotional equilibrium. When a situation feels incomplete, especially in relationships, the mind keeps revisiting it in different forms, trying to construct a coherent explanation that resolves uncertainty. However, instead of achieving closure, this process often deepens attachment because repeated mental engagement strengthens neural pathways associated with the person or experience. Each time the memory is revisited, it becomes more emotionally reinforced, not less. This happens because the brain does not strictly differentiate between actual experience and vividly imagined reconstruction. When someone repeatedly thinks about a person in search of answers, the emotional system activates as if the interaction is still ongoing. This creates a paradox where the attempt to finish the emotional loop actually keeps it alive. The more the mind analyzes tone, meaning, or intent from past interactions, the more emotionally significant those fragments become. In this state, ambiguity becomes fuel. Lack of clarity forces the imagination to fill gaps, and those imagined interpretations often carry stronger emotional weight than reality. Instead of dissolving attachment, the search for closure repeatedly reopens the emotional channel. The mind begins to associate relief not with resolution, but with continued engagement, because engagement temporarily reduces uncertainty even if it does not solve it. Over time, this creates a cycle where thinking about the situation feels necessary, even compulsive. The emotional system learns that revisiting the connection provides temporary relief from uncertainty, which reinforces the habit of mental return. Rather than closing the attachment, the psyche unintentionally strengthens it through repetition, making the person feel more internally connected rather than detached from what they are trying to understand. Inner conflict between logic and emotion arises when two parallel processing systems within the mind generate opposing interpretations of the same experience. The logical system relies on structure, evidence, and consistency, aiming to reduce ambiguity through rational explanation. The emotional system, however, operates through association, memory, and physiological response, often reacting to subtle cues that logic cannot easily quantify or validate. When both systems are activated by the same relational experience, they can begin to contradict each other. This contradiction creates psychological tension. Logic may identify a situation as unclear, impractical, or unsupported by facts, while emotion simultaneously registers attachment, longing, or significance. Neither system fully overrides the other, leading to a persistent state of internal debate. The individual may oscillate between understanding something intellectually and feeling something completely different emotionally, without either side fully resolving the experience. The conflict intensifies because emotional responses are not easily silenced by reasoning. Even when logic presents a coherent conclusion, emotional memory continues to generate signals based on past experience and associative meaning. This creates a layered perception where one part of the mind attempts to detach while another remains engaged, producing inconsistency in thought patterns and behavioral impulses. At the same time, the brain seeks coherence, so it continuously tries to reconcile these opposing inputs. This often results in overanalysis, where the mind repeatedly reinterprets the same situation from different angles, attempting to align feeling with reasoning. However, because emotional processing does not follow logical structure, full alignment rarely occurs. As a result, the individual experiences fragmentation in perception. Decisions feel uncertain, interpretations shift depending on emotional state, and internal narratives fluctuate between clarity and confusion. The tension itself becomes a constant background process, shaping attention and thought patterns without offering stable resolution. The more someone resists a feeling, the stronger it becomes because psychological resistance does not eliminate emotional content. It increases internal attention toward it. When a person consciously tries to suppress, ignore, or reject an emotion, the mind must first register that emotion in order to suppress it. This repeated monitoring keeps the emotional signal active in awareness, even if indirectly. Instead of fading, the feeling becomes reinforced through constant internal reference. This happens due to a process known in cognitive psychology as ironic monitoring, where efforts to avoid thinking about something require continuous subconscious scanning to ensure it is not being thought about. That scanning itself keeps the thought accessible. As a result, suppression creates a paradox where the mind remains locked onto the very content it is trying to avoid. Emotionally, resistance also prevents processing. Feelings are meant to move through stages of recognition, expression, and integration. When a feeling is blocked at any stage, it does not complete its cycle. Instead, it remains stored in an active form within the nervous system. Because it is unresolved, it continues to seek expression through indirect pathways such as intrusive thoughts, heightened sensitivity, or emotional spikes triggered by unrelated cues. Resistance also increases emotional contrast. The stronger the attempt to suppress a feeling, the more noticeable its return becomes. This contrast creates the perception that the emotion is intensifying, even if its actual source has not changed. The mind interprets repeated reemergence as growth, reinforcing the belief that the feeling is becoming stronger over time. Resistance creates internal fragmentation. One part of the mind experiences the feeling, while another part actively rejects it. This split keeps attention focused inward, increasing psychological engagement with the emotion. Instead of detaching, the individual becomes more entangled because energy is continuously directed toward managing the resistance itself, which sustains the emotional presence rather than dissolving it over time in a natural cognitive cycle of resolution. Emotional dependency can form without mutual acknowledgement, because attachment systems in the brain are activated by perception and internal meaning, not only by confirmed reciprocity. When a person repeatedly occupies emotional attention through memory, imagination, or anticipation, the mind begins to treat that presence as significant, even in the absence of explicit mutual engagement. This process is gradual and often unnoticed because it develops within internal cognition rather than external interaction. The brain is wired to create associative links between emotional arousal and specific individuals or stimuli. If a person becomes associated with strong emotional states such as comfort, longing, uncertainty, or excitement, the nervous system begins to prioritize them in internal processing. Over time, these associations can strengthen independently of whether the connection is reciprocated or even actively maintained. Without mutual acknowledgement, the emotional system does not receive stabilizing feedback, but it continues to seek resolution. This lack of closure encourages the mind to fill gaps with imagination, replaying past interactions or constructing hypothetical scenarios. These internal reconstructions often carry emotional weight because they are reinforced by existing attachment signals in the nervous system. As a result, the dependency is not built on real-time interaction, but on repeated mental engagement. Another factor is intermittent reinforcement through thought patterns. Even occasional reminders such as memories, coincidences, or triggers can reactivate the emotional link, strengthening it further. The unpredictability of these activations increases psychological salience, making the attachment more persistent. This creates a situation where emotional investment grows inside one mind while remaining unacknowledged externally. The dependency exists not because of shared experience, but because the internal system has repeatedly reinforced the significance of that person through thought, memory, and unresolved emotional engagement over time. Awareness of this dynamic gives you power over its outcome because once a psychological process becomes conscious, it shifts from automatic reaction to observable pattern. Most emotional entanglements operate below awareness, where thoughts, projections, and attachments are experienced as reality rather than interpreted as mental activity. When a person begins to recognize how these internal mechanisms work, the emotional intensity loses some of its unconscious control over perception. This awareness introduces a critical separation between experience and interpretation. Instead of being fully absorbed in emotional reactions, the individual can begin to identify what is happening internally as a process of the mind, rather than an external truth about another person. This distinction reduces the sense of inevitability that often fuels emotional escalation. What once felt overwhelming starts to appear as a sequence of mental and emotional responses that follow identifiable patterns. With awareness, projection also weakens,